Hey everyone, I'm Michael Martin. I'm the head of communities at Signalfire. We're an AI-driven VC fund, and I'm also the XPRIZE ambassador. I've been working closely with Amir over the past few years and with Eileen since, I guess, last year to help organize the day, and I'll be your MC for the day. So I'll be announcing the transitions, but also when lunch is happening, when drinks are happening. So two very important things for you all to know. But you know, as we've mentioned, we're going to kick off the day today with a conversation about AI and human rights between the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein, and Sam Altman, the president of Y Combinator. So in case you all don't know who they are and their backgrounds, High Commissioner Zeid has served as the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights in Geneva since 2014 and is recognized as the UN's leading representative on human rights. He has had a distinguished career as an international diplomat as well at Jordan's permanent representative to the UN in New York and as an ambassador to the United States, among other roles. Sam Altman is the president of Y Combinator, one of the Valley's premier tech incubators. He's led investing in many startups, include Airbnb, Dropbox, Reddit, among others. He's also the co-founder and co-chair of OpenAI, a national nonprofit artificial intelligence research company exploring AGI. He studied computer science at Stanford and worked at the Stanford AI lab. And moderating the conversation is Eileen, who most of you likely know. She's the executive director of GDPi. She worked closely with the Office of High Commissioner when she served as the U.S. ambassador to the Human Rights Council in Geneva during the Obama administration. And she studied international law and human rights at Stanford Law School and has a PhD in ethics. So I'll let you take it over, Eileen. Thank you.
Great. So this is a wonderful opportunity to sit down with you two. I cannot think of two more thoughtful, well-placed people to have this conversation. Our purpose here is to kind of role model the kind of cross-sector, cross-cultural dialogue that needs to happen between Silicon Valley technologists and global policy leaders if we're going to move this forward. And we're going to explore how a leading tech entrepreneur and a revered international diplomat come at this subject. You both are so well placed. I will just mention High Commissioner Zeid's mandate covers all of the areas on which AI has implications for human rights: privacy, work, discrimination, autonomous weapons, and the benefits. Sam is really unique in the Valley in that he has manifests a lot of creative leadership on problem solving and taking on some of the really tough challenges. And he's chosen to apply his entrepreneurship in the nonprofit realm and OpenAI, dealing with the very big problem, or the big questions really, around artificial general intelligence. And he's also taken on this experiment at the other end of the spectrum, very concretely, on universal basic income and the challenges around labor displacement, distribution of wealth, and finding meaningful work. So you've both really stepped out of your intellectual comfort zones, and I really appreciate you being here. I want us to start by opening it up and asking you, from where you sit, how do you come at this subject of human-centered AI? I'll start with High Commissioner. Tell us about your journey into this subject, what motivated you to get involved, and maybe place it in the larger context of what's going on globally in the human rights realm, and how important you think the human rights framework will be to this human-centered AI conversation.
Well, first of all, Eileen, your summary or your introduction was so masterful that you, in one way, answered the questions that you are going to propose in the next half an hour. Look, it's very exciting for us because it's almost the dawn of a courtship between two cultures, rather complex, one legal and with a long history, and the other a technological culture steeped in its own grammar, its own lexicon, its own way of thinking. And this courtship has been brought about by dint of circumstance, realizing that the world, the way we see it from the human rights perspective, is taking on trajectories which seem to be contradictory. On the one hand, we see a continued progression in the assertion and the realization of rights all around the world. We saw most recently in Ireland 2 referenda which produced results hitherto thought impossible. At the same time, we look around, we see what's happening in this country, we see the populists, the demagogues, the violent extremists, we see oppression is back. Internet freedom has been on the decline for 7 years in a row around the world. We see human rights defenders, who are often technologists, thrown into a prison for offering an opinion, arbitrarily so. And so in all of that, we see a canvas, a background, which is of concern to us. And if we have a canvas that's dotted with glass and bits of flesh and blood, can we paint a pretty picture on it through technology? And that's the question that, from our perspective, we must ask. In other words, will technology help us stem the bleeding and the suffering of people around the world, or will it contribute to its acceleration? And it's a fundamental question that must be asked. It's not to say that the world of technology must supplant the human rights community globally, but it's the effect that it's going to have on the work that we are trying to bring forward. Finally, this other thought that has occurred to us, that as we become more and more dependent on technology, which itself is increasingly and almost wholly dependent on electric power, and the threat of cybersecurity continues to loom large as the world continues to suffer from dislocation, is it not the case that we are just inching our way back to a pre-industrial existence should it all fail? Should we have no grid that functions properly, no internet, no power to sustain the civilization we have? Ideally, what you need then is a body of law that will keep it together, notwithstanding this sort of effect. And ultimately, that question also must be asked.
So I'm going to do a little twist on this question for Sam. Not only how do you come at human-centered AI, but I'm curious how and when you came to understand it might be your responsibility to deal with some of the implications of technology, and how do you generally think about the responsibility of the tech sector as it relates to the implications of AI?
Well, I think that the arrival of true AI, AI that is smarter than a human in every way, wildly smarter, will be the most important event in human history. By a lot. And I think it's quite remarkable. There's a lot of debate in sort of the Silicon Valley conversation about is AGI 10 years away or 100 years away, and people get into huge arguments about this. And I don't think it matters that much. I mean, I think, depending on when you want to start the clock, maybe humanity has been around for 60,000 to 300,000 years. Biological life has been around for a couple of billion. And now we're in the last kind of 10 to 50, 10 to 100, maybe. And that's a remarkable time to be alive. Like the magnitude, the sort of the enormity of this is never lost on me. We are so close to the event horizon, and things are going to be so unrecognizably different on the other side. And so that felt like the most important problem to work on. I think that can either go fantastically well, and I hope it does, I think it will, or quite badly. And I think the decisions that we make in the next couple of years are likely to determine how that goes. This can either be technology that is controlled by a single entity for specific gains, or it can be something that all of humanity benefits from, figures out how to maintain and protect and promote the human rights of everyone, figures out how to let everyone live the life they want. But this is a giant transformation. And I was dismayed that there was not more work on it. I got incredibly lucky in my career. I retired at 26, and I was not sure what I wanted to do. But this felt like the most important area to spend my time and money on. I think getting this right is, I think people use the phrase existential risk way too much, but I think this one actually is. And so that was what I wanted to work on.
Wow, that's great. I think it's really fascinating to bring that long time horizon in and say, it doesn't matter if it's 10 years or 100 years, it's short in the scheme of things. I think that's very useful to end that conversation and say, let's get on it. I think that's right. So neither of you touched on the relevance of the international human rights law framework so explicitly to this movement for human-centered AI. And I'm curious how much you've thought about that and how important you think that will be to this conversation.
Okay. It is vital to recall that we have 9 human rights treaties, the core treaties, which basically explain the position of humanity in respect of the prohibition on torture, prohibition on enforced disappearances, the assertion of a rights agenda where the child is concerned, where the ending of discrimination against women are concerned, the rights of persons with disabilities, and so on and so forth. All of this came out of the appalling and bloody experiences of the early part of the 20th century. And it was the death of upwards of 100 million people that crystallized in the thinking of humankind at the time that the previous reliance on customary law was not enough, that we had to create codified law, contract law, that would bind states to their obligations. And so in that sense, it is a sort of historical distillation of human experience into a legal framework where we didn't have to once again go through another cataclysm to then wake up and realize that we must develop it. It's now been developed, and it takes care of most situations that are brought before us and which are thought to be rather unique. But they're not really. They're not. We've gone through these sorts of permutations before, not at the pace and the acceleration that Sam was speaking about earlier. So what we have is actually not that bad. And when you look at, for instance, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the issue of freedom of expression and the brake asserted on it in terms of the prohibition on the incitement to hatred and violence, there is enough commentary on that to give us some guidance and can be further fine-tuned. But it needs to be understood that for most of the planet, that is the applicable standard. That is the applicable law, not the First Amendment. And that countries have obligations under that particular law. And this is what we hope we can develop in terms of an understanding between AI and AI that's human-centered, for which a framework already more or less exists, and it just needs to be fine-tuned.
Just one quick comment. I think your point that it's a distillation of human experience, it's not simply a remnant of one point in history. I think that's a very useful framing for this conversation, that it captures a lot of human thought, not just one moment. So,
Yeah.
Look, I think we're actually reasonably good at defining what human rights should be, although it does change over time, but then we're pretty bad at actually sticking to them. It's many times in human history, people have sat up on stages and said, well, we figured out human rights, we just need, we're done. They evolve, and they should evolve. As I always think about what are our grandchildren 50, 100 years from now going to think that we did that's barbaric, that we all think is okay, and I'm sure there's plenty of things like that. So I think human rights evolve, but I agree with the High Commissioner. We've got a pretty good document. The problem is, humans are irrational, and stuff goes out the window when emotions are on high, and there's plenty of bad people in the world. And so I think we are better at saying what human rights should be than guaranteeing them for everyone. But it is a complex topic, and I'm sure we haven't defined them perfectly yet either. One thing that I think gives me great optimism is that I believe, although it is impossible for anyone to write down exactly what all of human rights should be and get everybody else on the planet to agree to that, I think we already have something good enough that if we could just have it enacted everywhere, we'd be happy, and I think AGI can help us do that with less emotion and bad people and things like that. I also think that we will be able to have the AI, learn the collective value function of humanity. And that will be more accurate than trying to write it down in language.
And that's what we have to make sure happens, is that
Totally,
the AI
totally.
incorporates that set of human values.
Yeah, I mean, we have a team at OpenAI that is currently called the safety team. There's a team called the policy team. There's a team sort of called the strategy team. I have been encouraging them to all come together and just rename it the Utopia team, because that is what we're going for, right? Like, we are trying to, technology aside, we will get the technology to work. Technology aside, how do we get the world outcome we want? And that you need to really think about from the beginning with people from a very diverse set of backgrounds and education.
So I think we want to call it the human rights team.
It's not a bad name. It's actually quite a good name.
I'm in all seriousness, for me, the animating energy here is to advocate for that lens. And I really think it does a lot of work for the tech community.
With a broad enough definition of what human rights are,
Yeah.
I agree that that's a great name.
Yeah.
Today, you would not say it is a human right to have every material desire you have fulfilled. And that may be something that we agree is a human right in 100 or 200 years. But with a broad enough definition, that it is a human right to not die ever of a disease.
Yeah. So at least for now, we'd go for what are the minimal standards rather than utopia.
But again, I think what's hard is this is an event horizon in the kind of most extreme definition of the word, and trying to talk about anything on the other side. There's this quote from a boxer, it might be Muhammad Ali, that's like, everyone's got a plan till you get punched in the face.
Yeah.
And we have all these great plans. And I hope they're good, and I hope we've been thoughtful about them, and I hope they work, but this thing that's going to happen is so unprecedented and so difficult to reason about that I think the error bounds on the other side of the outcome are huge, and so you need flexible plans.
Yeah.
I think the key point that you raised in the beginning, Eileen, is that as technology and AI speed up in terms of their insertion into our daily lives in ways, again, that in the past we couldn't properly conceive of, there's a tendency to be hurried in the way that we think about what needs to be applied. And in the daily froth of information that comes in and out and sweeps us away, you almost feel at a loss to know where to begin, and you need an anchor point. The anchor points already exist. It's just being aware of them. And it's true what Sam says, that the interpretation of the law can shift and change subject to the circumstances that occupy us. But the grounding and the principles, the inalienable rights that we are all basically owed as rights bearers, that doesn't change. And it gives us, Kissinger's point about needing more time for equanimity, for a calming of the soul, for reflection. Well, this is afforded by the fact that we already have something in place. We don't have to re-engineer it and start again. And it's just an awareness of it. Now, the problem that I see is this, that we in the human rights community, global community, basically human rights lawyers, are wedded to a legal culture that's very technical, that's almost impenetrable to the non-legal mind in many respects. And likewise, we see this in the world of tech. So I was saying to Eileen last, I think it was in January, I was invited by Google DeepMind to a dinner. And for 2 hours, I was completely lost. I had no idea what these people were talking about. And until toward the end, I realized that it wasn't so difficult to understand. But they had wrapped it in a jargon and in a language which made it inaccessible. We do the same from the human rights world. We do exactly the same. If you read a general comment on one of the treaties, you will find that unless you have legal training, you're not going to understand what lex specialis is, right? And so somehow we have to break down these walls. We have to talk to each other as two sort of human beings engaged in courtship, excited but weary, and then out of that, develop a fusion where you can see how both sides can benefit immensely from each other and not work in a sort of the different sort of black boxes, unaware of what the other is doing.
That's great. So this idea of developing a shared lexicon, and you guys are doing better than I've seen in most instances of this kind of conversation where it's like no connection. So I also picked up that both of you sort of pointed to this idea of enduring principles, core principles, but evolving meaning of what it takes to live up to those principles. I call that like, the doctrine needs to evolve with a changing context. We now live in a globalized, digitized world. It's demanding new things, but our enduring principles remain, and that's what we've got with the Human Rights Framework. So I want to shift a little bit to some of the specific, more concrete initiatives you've been involved in. Both of you. And Sam, you, as I said, you've taken on two of the most challenging AI issues at opposite ends of the spectrum, as I see it, AGI and UBI. And so let's just start with the AGI. You've said if it happens, it will be the biggest tech thing that ever happened.
Oh, it will happen. I just don't know when.
It will happen, okay. So that's a debate right there, right?
Not that many people are willing to take the "it will never happen"
Okay.
side of that debate. There's again, I think the debate gets lost in this. Is it 10 or 100 years?
Yes. So to bring time frame in, I got
But the interesting thing is that there's very few people that say like, it's never going to happen. It can't happen.
Fascinating. Okay, so to say a little bit more about OpenAI, what the animating, you actually got to the animating energy behind its creation in your opening here, but say a little bit more about the primary risk you were trying to protect against.
Sure. I think, like, I don't know how to say this without sounding grandiose. Like, we are going to create, someone in the world is going to create sort of the children of humanity. And that may look a lot like humans, it may look very different, but in any case, it is going to be this major step forward. And what that world looks like, I think we all deserve a say in and we all deserve to benefit from. I think one human right will be that you deserve the benefits of AGI. And we were concerned about a number of scenarios. One, a single tech company developing this and having sort of this one AI to rule them all that they use for whatever they want, and also that is like unchecked. If you have a single AGI in the world and it's like 1 billion times smarter than the next smartest entity, which would be the smartest human, that feels deeply unstable, because how are you going to stop that if it goes off the rails? And so, either concentrated benefit or ability to harm a single AI controlled by a single company seem bad. Another thing that seems bad is a government that does not care about human rights being the first to develop AGI. And you can imagine all kinds of things that you could use that for that are extremely dystopic. So I think in a world where the US government functioned like it used to, like I'd like it to, I would still be on the beach. The government would have a new Manhattan project, an Apollo project. They'd be doing this. That's not the world we have, and so here we are with OpenAI. But our goal is to develop AGI, get safety right, get the human-centered aspects of it right, and then share the benefits equally among all people of the world. And that is the animating force.
Great. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, listening to Sam, it's not just the difference in age, but difference in intelligence. He's far smarter than I am.
That's probably not
and
true.
I feel completely so analog it hurts. Because, I mean, I can't understand AGI, to be honest here, because every major advance in terms of progress, social progress, didn't come from a majority-held position. It came from a very few people who decided that they in their society were going to end slavery against an overwhelming tide of opinion against it. And those people who were going to advocate this were at great risk to their lives. In other words, there's a willingness to self-sacrifice that humans have, which you somehow need to get into AGI. And that opinion starts from a very small corner of society, and then grows, and then reaches a tipping point, and then becomes something so obvious that everyone adheres to it. And whether we talk about the ending of slavery, the ending of the death penalty, the ending of apartheid within the Afrikaner community, whatever it is, it doesn't start from a majority opinion. It starts from a minority opinion, right? So it starts with the willingness to self-sacrifice. The other thing, I was reading an account of Charles Darwin's early thinking on the flight over. And what was so remarkable to me is that when he finished his studies and finished reading Virgil and Homer and Euclid, and he just had to do his residency requirements in college to get through, his hand just slipped on two texts. His two celebrated works, one by Herschel and the other one by Alexander von Humboldt. And it was those two texts, incidentally, that he sort of slipped upon that set the stage for the Darwinian revolution that is still in play today, right? I mean, it's amazing. And can AGI replicate that? I mean, it's the preparation on one side and then the incidental occurrences on the other that shape human progress in a way that is dramatic and profound and beautiful. And that, I don't know if AGI can account for that. It's not just computational. It can't just be computational.
So, Sam, you're going to add, but it's not only that it's not just computational. I mean, this is a thing that I haven't heard other people raise very much, this human capacity for self-sacrifice.
Well, I'll start with that. There are a number of things in evolution that don't seem like they have been selected for. Human capacity to self-sacrifice is one of them. In a vacuum, if it's just you, if you do something that gets yourself killed for the good of the group before you reproduce, that's probably bad. Psychosis, like why has that been left in evolution? That's generally quite bad for the individual. It is, though, in rare instances, quite good for the group. And so there are a number of things that are negative to the individual, good for the group in rare circumstances that evolution has let stay. And an interesting point is that now that we have multiple agents in some of our work that work together, is this on the record?
Yes.
Oh, well, you're not going to get to hear a great story then.
No, go ahead.
No, I really can't.
Take the names out.
So I'll just say, now that we have some work where we have many agents on teams in simulations that are trying to accomplish shared goals, they very early learn, and they learn much better than humans do who have egos in the way, that sometimes you do need to self-sacrifice. Sometimes you do need to do something for your team. In fact, in one of these things, we have a variable called team spirit, and we can do this slider of how much the agents care about themselves versus their group, and you see very different behavior depending on where you put that slider. They learn very different things. They make very different decisions. But to back this up, like, we all think we're like quite smart, and kind of we are, but when you boil it down, each of you is about 100 billion neurons, 100 trillion synapses, and some hormones that act on those, and that's about it. And then, like between 1 and 10 times a second, those neurons fire and do their thing. And we can get into metaphysical arguments if we have time. We probably don't, but let's just take as an assumption that that's it. There's nothing else. All of that will be modelable on an equivalently powered computer. We've got a ways to get there. We have maybe 3 orders of magnitude from our best computers now. Human brain it's incredibly slow, but it's incredibly powerful. It's just a huge amount of compute. But we will get there, and we will figure out the learning algorithms. They don't seem to be that difficult. One of the things that's quite amazing about the human brain is, if you have an accident or something, you can take a piece of the neocortex that used to help you see and reattach it to the neurons from your ear, and now it'll learn to hear. And I think that and other things like that are suggestive that learning actually is generalizable. And in our own work so far, we have seen that the learning algorithms are generalizable. The same algorithm that we use to learn how to control humanoid robots can also be learned to recognize images, to do strategic planning, to write short stories. So I think we're onto something there. But it's an uncomfortable thought, but I think everything we say, well, that's never going to be done in a computer, there is no solid logical argument about why it won't. Because it's all just neurons firing in circuits.
fascinating. So it's going to be
Everything, every feeling, every thought, every memory is represented in
so
this.
that choice up front about what our values are and what we're trying to get it to do becomes that much more important.
Yeah, or at least that we're going to have it learn our value function.
Yeah. Okay, I want to actually stay on the specifics that you've been involved with, but go at the other end, UBI. Sure. Because I think a lot of people don't know about that experiment, and obviously there's so much concern growing around labor displacement, wealth distribution. So tell us about that one.
Okay, so I would like to say that I think universal basic income, the idea where you give people a fixed amount of money every month, maybe unconditionally, maybe tied to some expanded definition of work, is a very partial solution to the problems that we're going to face as a society. It does not address the satisfaction, the community, the structure, fulfilling the need to be needed, the identity, a lot of things it doesn't do. And I get quite frustrated when people say, well, no problem, we'll have UBI and everybody will be happy. If people don't feel like they're part of a community, if people don't feel like they provide value to others, they have a way to sort of fulfill their ego, win the game, be part of the community, none of this is going to work. So, partial solution. That said, I think we are getting close to a world, maybe if we could like figure out how to fix housing regulation, we're already in a world where we do have enough to go around. And if we could take the pressure off people so that people could do what they want, study new things, quit a job with an abusive boss, take time off to like take care of their sick children, that would be better. And that would be a floor. People, I think, given that the human drive is what it is, will still find new things to do. And you know, like people have been projecting 4-hour work weeks for everyone for a long time. It seems like we just don't want that. It's not that we can't have it. People will just keep leveling up what they want. But I think we are going to get to this world when the AI comes where we have enough resources and most current jobs go away. And then there will be some transition time until we get to the new jobs. And so the question is, if you give people enough money so that they don't have to work to fulfill their basic needs, what do they do? And this turns out to be a sort of Rorschach test on what people think about human nature. You know, people are like, well, you know, they'll just commit crimes and do drugs, or people think like, well, they'll study new things and, you know, get new jobs. And it's become very interesting to me if I can guess what a new person I meet is going to say, based on the context I meet them in about it. But we are doing an experiment. We finished up our pilot early this year, where we will do this for thousands of people for 5 years, and we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. I'm not interested in like the traditional economics questions about how will we pay for this, anything like that, because I think in a world where we need it, you know, in a world where the AI takes all the jobs, it also drops the cost of goods and services to damn near zero. And so, housing aside, so we'll be able to afford this if we want. The question for me is, are people happier? What do they spend their time doing? Are they healthier? Are they more fulfilled? Do they get new jobs? Do they move? And that's what we're going to see. So we're going to start a very large-scale study. This will be the largest study in the history of the world by far, in early next year, in multiple sites around the U.S., in multiple different treatment arms. So some conditional, some not conditional, a few other things as well. And the goal is like when we get to this sort of like post-abundance world, what are people going to do with their lives, and what can we learn now, while we don't have to put this in place, to inform the policy decisions. So we're not doing the normal thing of like wait for a crisis and then have a fight in Congress on C-SPAN that day, but actually have data to look at.
Do you want to, I mean, is this about changing the meaning of money?
Well, not really. I mean, I think you'll still have money and you'll pay for some things. I think there may be like machine money and human money, and you know, people already put this big premium on handmade goods, rare goods. I think that'll keep going up. So I can see a world where there's like two very different kinds of money. But for me, this is just about like changing the social contract, and also I hope this is about sort of like reigniting some American unification. I think one thing that would be quite cool is if we tied this to GDP. So that the better, like if instead of a fixed dollar amount, every citizen basically owned a share of US Inc. And in a year where the GDP went up a lot and everyone did better and we made good choices collectively that made our country more wealthy, you got more money that year. And in a year where we did a lot of stupid things and it got worse, you got less. And I think we have so lost, for good reason, I wouldn't want like another war to get this, but we have so lost this sort of American unity where you're with people from very different socioeconomic backgrounds together in this intense experience, or you work for the same big companies or whatever, that getting it back by some combination of like mandatory national service and a share of the GDP for everybody, where we all feel like we're on the same team again, would be great.
I have a specific for you, but do you want to jump in on this one?
The last time I was in Silicon Valley was in September of 2017, and absolutely amazed by what I was hearing and seeing in the 2 or 3 days that I was here. 3 or 4 days after that, I was in Libya, in Tripoli. Libya is the one country where the UN doesn't have a presence because it is so dangerous. It's basically Mad Max country run by armed groups. There is a government, but it's not in as much control as that they would like to enjoy. And when I was in that space, having been in Silicon Valley, a space that would be recognizable to humanity 300 or 400 years ago, because really there was no difference from that existence and the existence in the German principalities during the 30 Years' War. The same brutalities, the same denial, vitiated, the complete range of rights vitiated. And the problem, I think, with Sam's narrative is that it is very Western-centric. It is basically a narrative for the North. And you may be right that the North will not have a giant sort of therapist's bench sort of depicted for it as requiring meaning, whether metaphysical or existential. But the rest of the world is going to be struggling in ever more or ever greater levels of desperation. The beauty of the human rights framework is that it covers all these different contexts. It is a single unifying set of universal principles anchored in law. And that's the bridge between the two. That's the space in which we operate. And I think what we need from the technologist's point of view is a deeper understanding, actually going to these conflict areas, actually sitting in people's homes after they've been bombed, and understanding that that is also part of our world. And how are we going to ensure that the rest, the global north, doesn't become like the global south in many respects, and bring a country like Libya into a Silicon Valley type of existence. But I think in overall terms, what we need is a sort of deeper thoughtfulness about all of this, that we don't rush headlong in to these areas. And that's why I applaud what you're doing, because I think it's not just a rush to market of a product and then trying to develop market share and profitability out of it, but understanding that ultimately, if we are to think about human happiness, that really comes from one thing, and we all know it. It's from service. You're a happier human being if you serve other human beings. If you think selfishly about your own condition, you will be profoundly unhappy for most of your life. And that's the basic, in all the religious traditions, that's the underlying rule that always emerges. So a life anchored in service to others is really what a human rights life is. It's caring about the rights of everyone else, not just about my own people, my own constituency, my own tribe, that's not it. We will find protection if we care about the lives of everyone. So I would urge that we don't think of a sort of Western-centric view of things, or just an American-centric, but the rest of the world is bleeding, and we have to stem that bleeding.
Great.
I'm a little confused. I completely agree. I guess that's the good news. I do think that, when it comes to, economics, that the countries do need to make their own framework there. But I think AGI is very global by nature, and it will help the people the most that are in the worst place right now.
And so you're going to have to help us see how that happens. That's what people are struggling with. It still feels alien for the analog brain. I'll put it that way.
Well, it is alien, right? This is when this happens, this will be like aliens landing on a spaceship.
Yeah.
It'll be that different.
Yes. Yes. Oh my gosh. I have so many more questions. Oh, we could go on. I have to give you an opportunity to talk about why you're here a little bit in Silicon Valley on this trip, which is that you are thinking about opening an office here for deeper engagement with the tech community, which is interesting. I know you already have an arrangement with Microsoft where you guys are looking to figure out how tech can help advance human rights. But traditionally, we think of human rights obligations as resting with nation states, and there's this new movement to have companies embrace human rights responsibilities. And so say a little bit more about this vision that you have for the Office of the High Commissioner in Silicon Valley, and I'd love to get your response.
So basically, I'm here on a schmoozing drive. And I'd like to pivot from a discussion that I heard between my 15-year-old activist daughter and my wife. They live in New York, and I was about to go to work one day, and my daughter was going to school, and she was arguing with my wife, a daily occurrence in our house. And she was arguing because she was going to go down to Times Square with a group of friends. They're going to walk out of school, and they're going to go protest. And my wife said to her, "You can't do that. You have to tell the school. You can't just walk out. I mean, and they're responsible for your safety." And this threw my 15-year-old into a rage. And she said, "Mother," she said, "Mom, how can we possibly be protesting if we must first secure the permission of the school? I mean, it's sort of ridiculous, that sort of thing." What it shows me is that there's enormous energy in this generation coming through. An enormous sense that there are values worth fighting for. We see the insanity. I'm on record, but I've said this before. We've seen the insanity, the regression into ways of thinking, the modes of operation that hark back to the 20s and 30s of the 20th century, with different parallels that you can, and even before that, 1913, and with different parallels that you can appropriate to and inject in today's discourse. And so there's a liveliness and an awareness that these rights can be lost very quickly. You don't often think about them until they begin to disappear. One day you have access to credit cut. Next day you can't go to this particular location because X, Y, and Z has happened. And before you know it, it all slips away through a gap. And I think there's a realization there. So my hope is that using this as a sort of fuel, we begin this sort of dialogue between these cultures, between a culture of technology and AI, and we've heard AGI, that for us is largely alien, but exciting and interesting, and certainly augmented technology can be extremely helpful to us in investigating crimes against humanity, acts of genocide, putting evidentiary material together for prosecution. And not just that, but whether it's access to housing, access to safe sources of drinking water, whatever it may be, all of that, I think, is exciting. And it's like, as Sam was saying, it's just mitigating the worst possible effects of it, which is where we have to be on our guard. So I'm here we're opening up an office here. My colleague, Scott Campbell, who's over there sitting at the table, he's one of our most experienced field officials. And deeply steeped in human rights, the human rights framework. And our hope is that through workshops and interaction, we'll understand your world better, and we want you to understand our world. Ultimately, we all want the same thing, right? We want a creative life filled with a sort of meaningful a meaningful aspect to it, and to better the condition of the whole. We won't get there if we're pursuing narrow agenda, and neither the world of technology or the human rights world is thinking just in the narrowest sense, as we were talking about the fully autonomous weapon systems, or moving in that direction, because we've been there before and it was a terrible outcome.
I'm going to ask one last question, and maybe we'll ask if anybody in the audience has a burning question. Get ready. I want to ask about the debate in Silicon Valley. It was in the New York Times yesterday. Oh, you didn't see it? Oh, it's great. It's really fun. You know, I've understood that you have almost been asked to broker some of these debates, let's say between Elon Musk, who has likened AI to North Korea and could lead to World War III, and Mark Zuckerberg saying that he thinks Elon's being fairly irresponsible in his language. I actually think, strangely enough, even within the tech community, there is people are missing each other on their language and how they're using this terminology, and in some cases referring to existing AI, you know, machine learning that we have and positive applications versus AGI. So how do you see that debate?
Yeah, I mean, I never take these statements seriously. I think people are talking their book, and they have reasons to say whatever they say. I think most people would agree with what I said earlier, which is we have already today incredibly powerful narrow AI. If we never made another breakthrough, if we just scaled that up, it would transform the world economically and job-wise in ways that are difficult to imagine. If we never made another single breakthrough, if we never made a bigger computer. However, I also think most people would say that at some point in the next 10 to 100 years, we're going to get it generalized. And I think that's kind of like, I think like the media loves to make fights. I think people like to say things that advance whatever their company wants at that point. But I think when you back away from all of that, there's actually not much disagreement.
Yep.
I couldn't help but think when I had to stand in line at San Francisco airport to get through immigration. There's so many issues of inconvenience in our daily lives. If only we could employ narrow AI to solve, you know, lines at the DMV or lines at the airports, and so there are practical issues which we can, if properly employed, remove the inconvenience of these sorts of hurdles, and which would greatly improve the quality of life for many. And maybe we shouldn't be as ambitious as some are trying to be.
Not possible, right?
I feel for you. I hate standing in line in the airport as well. But like, if the debate is should we talk more about that or like survive as a species, I think it's fairly clear.
No, I don't disagree. I mean, look, you know, when you go back to the Manhattan Project and the discussions that Niels Bohr introduced into the discourse of the scientists, right? What was so amazing about it is that much of what he introduced eventually came to be. And one thinks to themselves, well, if it didn't start in 1943, if it started earlier, right? I mean, if the physicists began to think about these issues at an earlier stage, not when the project was so advanced, would we be at this position of discussing, you know, North Korea's nuclear file? What's going to happen? I mean, I've worked on the issue of smuggling of radioactive materials and fissile materials, and I tell you, it's a frightening file, this. The more you know about it, the more you're frightened by it. And these are issues which should have been properly plumbed at an earlier stage. They weren't, because in the middle of the Second World War, there was simply an imperative to get it done. But Bohr was asking the right questions, and that's what I think we need to do at this stage, essentially.
So I think I am unfortunately going to make an executive decision here in service of the program. I apologize for going over. I'm also going to say you guys were the first two people I asked. You were the first to say yes, this program was built around you, and you have left me somewhat optimistic. We're going to be very ambitious in service of humanity, and that's what this is all about. So please join me in thanking Sam Altman and the High Commissioner.